Maybe a very quick introduction of our speakers. So we're very fortunate to have with us today, first of all, Professor Lady Costa, Professor of Technology Law and Human Rights at the University of Tilburg at the Tilt. A true specialist, I think I can say, on privacy and data protection, especially data protection in the context of electronic communications, use of new technologies, law enforcement, even involved in a very large number of European research projects, and more recently, in the past couple of years, also in charge of the AI educational program at the Tilt at the University of Tilburg. So she's, I think, fair to say, not to oversell you too much, Eleni, but probably one of the bigger authorities in Europe on artificial intelligence and the AI Act. So she's very well positioned to introduce that topic. We also have with us today Mr. Peter Griffois, a colleague of mine, so also a lawyer and a partner at Timelex, working a lot on also data protection, information security issues, law enforcement, and recently also the use of artificial intelligence technologies in sensitive contexts, including in law enforcement and the analysis of electronic communications. So he's basically in charge of looking at impacts in general, human rights impacts, technology impacts of use of artificial intelligence in new contexts. So two excellent speakers who will be providing their perspective on how the AI Act is intended to work, what is intended to do, what the implications will be, and fundamentally whether it will resolve all of our problems. I think it's a very hot topic. It's something that we're all, I think, very interested in, because you have the underlying question of how do you start regulating AI to begin with. AI is such a broad concept. There's so many solutions and programs and techniques that are covered by the notion of artificial intelligence. Like, is it possible to regulate that at all? And you have kind of the same discussions that you always have with these new legislations. You have both the criticism that it is too early and too late. Too late because they're also already being adopted massively in the markets and the legislative process is too slow. But on the other hand, you also have people complaining that it's too early to provide any kind of regulation because fundamentally we don't know yet how artificial intelligence is going to impact our lives. But then that also might be a good argument for regulating it. Just a small anecdote before I pass the floor to Eleni. We had a presentation a couple of weeks ago of an artificial intelligence product for legal services. So the typical type of thing, an artificial intelligence that you can ask legal questions about specific niche topics, and it'll draft an answer for you to help you get started. Obviously, you have to review it. The sales pitch is not that it's an AI lawyer, but it does do a lot of the basic research to get you started. So we tested this AI product. We asked it a question, gave us a perfectly reasonable answer. So we tested and we said, okay, well, what if we ask the AI to now draft that in the form of an email that you'd want to send a client, just to see how many corners you can actually cut? And yet the AI did that. The person doing the presentation said, yes, sure, that's no problem. It can do that. Just ask the AI. And we asked the AI, can you do this in the form of an artificial intelligence, in the form of an email to a client? And it could do that. And we said, okay, so this looks great. What if we wanted to do this, for instance, in French, going to do translations as well? And the product developer said, actually, I don't know. It's certainly not something that we've built. It's not something that we are aware of, but maybe give it a try. So we did, and we asked it, can you translate it to French? And it did. And to me, that's an intriguing one, not from a liability perspective, but this was actually a product or a service, depending on how you look at it, being brought to the market that has functionalities that the developers don't know about. We can ask the question, can it do translations? I've never really thought about that. We don't really know if it's capable of doing that. And this kind of unpredictability, the difficulty of seeing what happens under the hood, is one of the big challenges in finding an appropriate way to regulate AI. If you're dealing with everything from GPS recommendations to brain surgery, all of those things are potentially covered by AI, and you don't necessarily know in all of those cases how it works and why it works the way it does. How do you go about regulating it, and is it a good idea? Just a brain teaser, sort of, to try to open the session. With that said, maybe I'll pass the floor to our first speaker, Professor Leni Costa, who can give us an introduction on what the AI Act is and where it comes from and how it may and may not work. It's a very exciting session since, yeah, we're working partially on official text, partially on leaked text, and partially on what we we know we might understand. So that will make for an interesting presentation. Lady, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. I think I don't deserve all the nice words you said, but I'll do my best. I will start with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that I'm not used to giving presentations on legislation without having the final text. So what happens with the AI Act, it's the first time that we have seen where before Christmas in December, we got all over the news. There has been a political deal. That means an agreement between the legislative bodies of the European Union on the AI Act. And everybody was super excited. So we were waiting to get the act. We're waiting and waiting and waiting. Christmas came. Christmas left. And then until now, the official text has not been finalized. It's the first time we see this in the history of the European Union legislative making. So that's something to keep in mind. There are a lot of issues at stake. So what we are working on with today is a leaked document. The leaked document means that there may be still changes. You will see that there are a lot of typos. There are a lot of mistakes in the numbering because elements have been deleted and new elements have been added. So all this is not a mistake. It's there because the text we have is not final. So I hope we can have somewhere in the summer another session, not with me, but in general, where we have the final text and we can discuss at another level. So here there may be questions that you have where I'm afraid I will say, I don't know. We are not sure what this means because very recently we got this leaked document. It is very long. It is more than 250 pages. And we are trying to make sense of things that seem to be the outcome of a lot of political compromise. So not everything makes sense, if I'm allowed to say. And I will explain you at several points what I mean. Also, because this is such a lengthy document, I had to make a choice. I had to make a choice of what I'm going to talk to you about. So what I have decided to do, I have decided to explain a little bit the scope, linking back to what Hans also mentioned as his example. And mainly I will focus on the risk. What is the risk? What is high risk according to the AI Act? Because that will actually sorry, the chat is also, I'm losing it a little bit. Yes, indeed, just to answer to the text. Yes, well, there is this discussion that the text will be most likely adopted in April. However, this is with a small question mark. So that's what they are trying to make, but they cannot make promises. They wanted to finish much sooner, but April will most likely be the time to see it, although there are rumors that it can go later on. So I'm going to focus on the element of risk, and I will explain you in a minute why risk is so important. And then I will speak a little bit about the conformity assessment, because what I want us to start with is how should we look at the AI Act? You already had a session about the GDPR, which is a human rights. It's a human rights-based regulation. You have, of course, several procedural rules there, but nobody can question that this is very heavily linked to fundamental rights. The AI Act is intended, and that was very clear in the explanatory memorandum when the proposal for the AI Act was put forward, that the AI Act is intended to come on top of the GDPR. So it is not there to replace provisions of the GDPR, but actually to complement. And at the same time, we have to say that we see the AI Act either over-regulated or under-regulating, and there is still a risk of clashes with the GDPR at specific points. So the subject matter is quite complicated. The final text we see in front of us is very different compared to what was there in the initial proposal of the European Commission. I'm not going to make the comparisons because that will take up a lot of time from the time we have in order to present you the AI Act. But what we have today in the text we have in our hands is that the purpose of the regulation, and this is a regulation and not a directive, so that means that it is immediately applicable in the European member states. And there is not too much room for maneuver and deviations from the national legislators. And that's what the European legislator wanted. So the purpose is, and I find it very complicated, I have to be very honest with you, is to improve the functioning of the internal market. So we need to make sure that products, AI products, can easily move within the European internal market. But then also promoting the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy artificial intelligence. So it's more a political statement than actually a subject matter if you read it, while at the same time ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, fundamental rights as they are protected in the European Charter, including democracy, rule of law, environmental protection against harmful effects of artificial intelligence systems. So for the ones that are familiar with European text, you will see that usually the subject matter is something much more simple, clear, and to the point. Everybody knows what the law we have in front of us is about. In this case, it's more like a political statement. We want to improve the functioning of the internal market. We will make sure that AI artificial intelligence, will be human-centric and trustworthy, etc., etc. So this is quite unique. And then it is complemented by a list of elements that are included and regulated in the AI Act. And this is also quite unique. So you will see here saying that the regulation lays down rules that are harmonized, obviously, for the placing on the market, the putting into service, and the use of artificial intelligence systems. So when in my talk I will be talking about the use of AI, I mean placing on the market, putting into service, and the use of AI systems. Just for reasons of simplicity, I will say use. Then there are the regulation lays down prohibitions. So it has a list of prohibited acts of certain AI practices. It lays down specific requirements for high-risk AI systems and obligations for operators. It introduces rules, transparency rules for certain AI systems, rules for the placing on the market of general-purpose AI models, rules on market monitoring, market surveillance, governance, and enforcement, and measures to support innovation. So you will see this is unique, actually. We have a subject matter which is a list of what is regulated in the AI Act. This shows a little bit the frustration, if I may say, of the legislator trying to make something that is acceptable by all parties. So I'm not sure how this can be in the final text. Even if it is, it doesn't help us a lot. I'm quite critical in this sense of the wording that is used. The scope is more clear, because it clarifies that there are a number of entities that are affected and to which the regulation applies. This applies to providers that place on the market or put into service AI systems, to deployers of AI systems that have their place of or establishment within the European Union, and that makes sense. But also the third element is very important, that it applies to providers and deployers of AI systems that have their place of establishment or they are located in a third country, so outside the European Union. So similar to what you heard, obviously, during the webinar on the GDPR, we see the so-called Brussels effect, the long arm of the European legislation, where in Europe we adopt rules, we adopt laws that we do not only impose on entities that have their establishment or they are located in the European Union, but we want to also apply these rules. We want to extend these obligations to entities that are outside the European Union, with the problems that it has, especially when it comes to enforcement. And maybe during the Q&A session, we will have time to answer, to discuss this. And I understand that Hans is also making note of the questions that come in the chat, because they are quite a bit. quite a few. So then it also applies to importers and distributors of AI systems, product manufacturers, representatives of providers when the providers are not established in the European Union, but they are required to have a representative within the Union, and affected persons that are located in the Union. And here I just want to make a small note. We don't have an element of citizenship or of residence. The affected persons that are located in the European Union, even if that means that they are just travelers, or they can be stateless people, they can be refugees, whatever, they are protected. So this is I would say this is the human rights aspect that we see in the GDPR and mirrored in the AI Act. I guess many we will have questions. What is a provider? What is a deployer? What is an importer? What is a distributor? I could spend an hour on this. Unfortunately, I don't have the time, but I can tell you that you find these definitions in Article 2 of the GDPR. In simple words, the provider is anyone, a natural or legal person that develops an AI system. And they place them in the market, very simply. The deployer is any person or any entity that uses an AI system under their authority, except where the AI system is used for the course of a personal, non-professional activity. So personal, not non-professional activity, like individual users using ChatGPT, they are out of scope. They are not considered deployers. Then we have a definition of importer, which is an entity that is established in the European Union that places on the market an AI system that bears the name or the trademark of a natural or legal person established outside the European Union. That's obvious. An importer is somebody who's in the Union and brings something from outside the Union. And distributor is any person in the supply chain who is not the provider and the importer. That's a very unique way of defining things in a negative way. So a distributor is somebody who's not a provider and not an importer that makes the system available on the union market. So my advice is, when you have a system and you want to see whether you fall under the AI Act or your clients fall under the AI Act and what kind of obligations belong to you or your client, I think the most important thing is that you make a very good analysis of what is their role. Are they deployers? Are they importers? Are they distributors? Etc., etc. So given, like, we do this in hours and hours. Imagine we have a full course on for our master students on AI governance and regulation, and we discuss the act for at least 4 hours, and still it's not enough. So I try to give you the main pointers, and then I would really suggest that you take a look at the regulation itself. This is a risk-based regulation, and the important element is that we need to understand whether a system is considered high risk under the regulation or not. And this is essential because there are different requirements depending on the level of risk. Another point that I don't have in the slides, but I would like you to remember, is no matter what people say, it is, in reality, it is a product safety regulation. We make all this fuss about risk and is it risky, is it not risky, what falls in, what falls out. But in reality, the gist of it is that we have a new conformity assessment procedure, and it is about making sure that AI systems come out in the market, in the European market, they have some kind of seal. And we will see that in the end of my presentation. The European Commission created this pyramid. Maybe you have seen it. It has been all over the web when introducing the AI Act, in order to explain that the AI Act is built on the assumption that we have 4 different types of of risk. The bottom one is low and minimal risk, limited risk, high risk, and unacceptable risk. As you will see, the pyramid going up, we have less space of the risky services or applications. I will tell you that this is a terrible picture, because actually the blue, the bottom, should be really, really, really big. So the low and minimal risk applications are the majority of the AI applications we will see in the market. The limited risk that require some transparency, that bring some transparency obligations, are a bit smaller. High risk are really very small number of applications compared to the multitude of AI systems we can have in the market. And finally, there is a tiny tip of the triangle that are the unacceptable risks. So actually, we will see that what the AI Act is regulating is not the majority of the AI services. So that answers a question that came implicitly from Hans in the introduction. It does bring some security in the market, and it is important because the aim is to regulate high risk, mainly high risk applications, and make sure that unacceptable risk applications are not entered into the market. But the majority of the applications will stay out of the scope, remain out of the scope of the AI Act, while the ones that present limited risk only entail some transparency requirements. So what is risk? I talk about risk and high risk. And what is risk? Well, we have a very long list of definitions in the AI Act, but not the definition of risk. Welcome to the vagueness of legal terms. We can say that a system can be considered high risk irrespective of whether it is a component of another system or whether it is put into service independently as a standalone product. That's something that we deduce from sorry, there is a question, but shall I take all questions in the end?
Better, yeah, we park all the questions. I'm collecting them, and we'll park them until the end for the Q&A session.
Very interesting, and I'm
they are. They always are.
Yeah, I'm tempted to answer them, but then we will not have time to go through the rest of the document. So we see that there is this clarification that you can have a component of a system or a standalone product. I will show you in a minute a very clear, I think, illustration of what this is. However, still, risk or high risk is not defined. So that means that every interpreter of the AI Act needs to make their own interpretation of the risk. However, there are some guidelines within the AI Act. So we will see Article 6, for example, which is the most important for high risk, that gives a number of criteria that when they are fulfilled, we assume that there is high risk and the product falls under the AI Act. So because we will talk a lot, you will read a lot, we will not talk about it so much, but you will read a lot in the AI Act, expressions like an AI system is a component of another system, or we talk about the standalone product, or we talked about the product with an AI component. I found this visualization excellent, and I have the reference here. It's not something I developed. So what can fall and what can be regulated under the AI Act are standalone AI products, as you see. It can be only the part which is an AI component of a product, or it can be a product with an AI component, and then we need to see which is the situation we have in front of us and when does the AI Act apply, right? So AI components can take all these three different approaches. I hope this is clear. So actually for me, visualization, especially when I teach law students, it's very difficult to understand it if you don't visualize it like this. The definition of the AI system in the AI Act changed a lot compared to what was proposed by the European Commission, which means that this is the outcome of a lot of negotiations between the European legislative bodies. And it would be useful for you to know, and maybe interesting, that it is very close to a new definition that was adopted by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in November last year. So actually we see an influence from the OECD to the AI Act. Now, the way how the leaked text defines AI Act, a definition of an AI system is as follows. This is a machine-based system that is designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy and that may exhibit adaptiveness after deployment, and that for explicit or implicit objectives infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions that can influence physical or virtual environments. If you ask me, I don't really understand a lot. And what I do is I sit together with my technical colleagues. And that's something that I think the AI Act will achieve, a lot of collaboration between legal and technical people, because there are provisions that are super legal, as we will see in a minute, but there are provisions that are super technical. So it is very difficult for me to understand what it means, what is this adaptiveness after deployment, what is the level of autonomy that we need to have in order to pass the threshold and consider the system as an AI system. Initially, the definition introduced by the European Parliament, it referred to specific techniques and said, if an AI system uses technique A, B, C, D, which could be modified through the annex, then it is considered an AI system under this regulation. This changed completely. So we have this definition that has a lot of terms that require and expect us to understand what is meant. Hopefully, we will expect to have some guidance from the European Commission on how to interpret the AI system. But of course, there is also a lot of guidance expected by the new artificial intelligence body that will be established soon. So first, we will look into the tip of the iceberg. What are the prohibited AI practices according to the AI Act? The list that was introduced by the European Commission has been expanded and narrowed down on some other elements. Here, I haven't copy-pasted the text because it's very lengthy text, but I have a list that will hopefully help you understand what are the categories that are now prohibited AI practices, and such systems cannot enter the market. Maybe there are very few exceptions, but I'm not going to focus on the exceptions today. The AI systems that manipulate human behavior to circumvent their free will, AI system that is used to exploit the vulnerabilities of people. So vulnerable groups are usually minors or elderly, people with disability, with specific social or economic situation. It is prohibited to use biometric categorization systems that use sensitive characteristics. So not all biometric categorization systems, but only when they use primarily sensitive characteristics, and to the element of sensitivity, we have the same understanding as sensitive data under the GDPR: political, religious, philosophical beliefs, sexual orientation, race, health, etc. So this is all specified, but as I told you, it's a huge document. To go into all the details, we need to look into every provision very carefully. Then it is prohibited to have systems of social scoring based on social behavior or personal characteristics. So systems like, I don't dare say again the Siri example in the Netherlands that is not working anymore, but this could be something that under the AI Act would have never been in place. It is forbidden to carry out untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet or CCTV footage to create facial recognition databases. So this is actually a big hit against a lot of social networking industries, a lot of the big platform providers who have been doing this extensively. And there is a question mark there. There was a lot of debate there whether this is something that could limit social science research, for example. But actually, the final text has a specific requirement that this is forbidden when the aim is the creation of facial recognition databases. So that leaves room for social scientists to keep doing the research, especially web scraping. Emotion recognition in the workplace and educational institutions, this is forbidden. Why specifically in the workplace and educational institutions? This is something that has been debated, whether emotion recognition should be forbidden in general. So there was a lot of negotiation between the Parliament and the Council in order to come to this decision. It is forbidden to use law enforcement for law enforcement purposes, real-time biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces, so not in private spaces. There are exceptions to this. So there it should be instead of for, except for targeted searches of victims, prevention of specific, substantial, and imminent threats to the life or physical safety or terrorist attacks, and the localization or identification of a person suspected of having committed one of these crimes. So before we send you the presentation, we will add there an except for, so that it is clear. So this is the list of prohibited AI practices. And there's not much to say here because these are prohibited. The most complex is the next one, the so-called high risk. And this is the majority of the rules and the importance of the AI Act. It is on the regulation of high-risk AI systems. Article 6 at the moment in the text, the leaked text that we have now, I don't expect the number of the article to change, but you never know. So I'm just explaining it. So Article 6, this is copy-pasted from the text because this is so important and I wanted you to see the wording at the moment. So there are two requirements in Article 6.1 and they both need to be cumulatively fulfilled. So it's not either or, it is cumulatively, they need to be fulfilled. That's why the or there is a bit confusing. The first one says that an AI system is intended to be used as a safety component of a product, or the AI system itself is a product subject to existing safety standards and assessments, such as toys, vehicles, and medical devices. So the example comes from me, and we will look into Annex 2 for that. And secondly, the product whose safety component pursuant to point A is the AI system or the AI system itself as a product, you remember the image I showed you, is required to undergo a third-party conformity assessment in accordance with existing European Union legislation. So in order to understand what Article 6 tells us, we need to look into Annex 2. And why Annex 2? Because an annex is a part of a regulation that can be amended, that can be modified easily. So we have the rules in Article 6, and we have our annexes that complement and explain the rules. I'm on track of time, Hans. So if we look at Annex 2, you will see there is a very long list. This is just one screenshot of documents, directives mainly, that are considered to be part of the union harmonization legislation. So you need to look whether the product that you have falls under this list that is in Annex 2. In order to have a high-risk system, you need to have one product, an AI system that is either product or safety component of a product that you find in Annex 2. And secondly, you need to have an obligation to undergo a third-party conformity assessment for this product. So both these requirements need to be cumulatively fulfilled in order to have an AI high-risk system. But also, according to the second paragraph of Article 6, we have a list of, as we call them, by default high-risk AI systems. And these by default AI high-risk systems are found in Annex 3 of the AI Act, and they refer to biometrics, they refer to critical infrastructures. So I have the list here. These are by default considered as high risk. So there you don't need to see whether there is an obligation to undergo a conformity assessment. Biometrics, critical infrastructure management, education or vocational training, employment, workers management, law enforcement, migration, asylum, etc. This list, as I said, is fixed now, but because it is part of an annex, it can be amended and adapted. There are rules about general purpose AI systems, and these were introduced by the European Parliament, because we had the whole ChatGPT explosion after the European Commission presented the first proposal. So in the end, in the negotiations, we did get specific rules about general purpose AI systems, and mainly those are considered to be low risk. And mainly for those, there are transparency requirements. Transparency requirements include an obligation to draw up technical documentation to further providers of the AI systems. They need to comply with EU copyright law. They need to disseminate summaries about the content used for training, etc. And there are also stricter obligations for what is called as high impact general purpose AI models with systemic risk. And there are some examples there. And finally, when it comes to generative AI, there is this crazy obligation. Trust me, it will never be happening. That users must be informed when they interact with AI. This is a chatbot. This is not a real person. There need to be information provided whether the personal data that is provided by the user is being processed, and AI content from a generative AI must be labeled and detectable in case of deepfakes. The whole point of deepfakes is to actually lure people into making specific choices. So this is a cry from the regulator trying to say, no, you really need to say it if you're using generative AI and this is deepfake and this is not a real story and whatever. But I have big doubts whether this will actually happen. So this is a very oversimplified flow diagram in order to understand whether we have a high risk system. So we ask, is it prohibited? If yes, we stop. Is it prohibited? No. Is it an Annex 3 system, which is by default high risk? Yes, then the act applies. Is this an Annex 2 system? Then we need to see whether it needs to undergo conformity assessment. If yes, then the AI applies. So this is a very, very simple diagram. Of course, we will expand it and we will make it much more complete, but just for you to see what are the questions we ask in order to find if a system is high risk. Peter will talk to us about fundamental rights impact assessments. He will talk to us more about the risk. So this is something I'm not covering. There are, as we said, transparency obligations, an obligation to include a human in the interaction with users. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is conformity assessment. So conformity assessment is something that we saw in the case of medical devices. I see passing a question about medical devices. So already we have this system of conformity assessment in medical devices, but also for the ones that have kids or nephews, nieces, whatever, you probably see that a lot of these cuddly toys we buy for our kids, they have a tag that says CE, and then we feel safe that the material that has been used is safe for our little ones to hold, etc. So the similar idea is for the AI systems, although it's not so cute. There is this following procedure. When a system is developed, it needs to undergo a conformity assessment and comply with the requirements. There needs to be a registration of standalone AI systems in an EU database. This is something I need to double check whether it changes in the last one. So take this with a pinch of salt. And there is a declaration of conformity that is signed, and then the system bears a CE marking and can enter the market. So this is what I wanted to say. I hope I'm good, relatively good on time. A small because Hans said that we have been doing an executive program on AI and the law at our university for years, and of course this year with the adoption of the AI Act, it's huge. We have already announced it, so you can find it on our the website of the university. And it takes place on 4 Mondays in June, and Hans is also one of the speakers.
Indeed. Thank you very much for the sort of the overview of the AI Act and what is in there and what is not there. We already have a ton of questions, so I'm not going to say to comment too much more on it, except to say we'll have an interesting debate. And I mean, yes, it's fascinating to see also what is expected of us. I think one of the last questions that's actually asked is, is there enough expertise and workforce to support all of those assessments? This is actually going to be one of the tricky things. This is a weird regulation because it has this odd mix of data protection and fundamental rights, which a lot of people in the sphere by now are used to, but then also product conformity and conformity assessments. So that's an entirely different way of approaching the market, sort of assessing the quality of a product, how to do that, how to do those risk assessments. We're all going to have to develop a lot of new skills, and to establish networks with bigger specialists, because this is not something that you can just do as a lawyer. This might be a traditional GDPR type evolution where we develop new skills as we go along, but it will be tricky. Anyway, so thank you very much for that, Eleni. That was I think a fantastic overview of what we know and do not yet know already. I'll pass the floor now to my colleague Peter, who can tell us a little bit more about impact assessments and what this is all going to mean in practice. Peter, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Hans. Just quick confirmation that you can hear me. All right. Yes, okay. All right, put a timer for myself because I swore that I was not going to make too many slides, and then I ended up making too many slides. So just to address that question that I've seen pop up a couple of times, yes, you will get the slides. So if at times I'm a little bit quicker to go over certain things, you can always check that later on. All right, so risk management and the Draft AI Act. So the leaked version is what we're talking about. I will be referring to certain articles, specifically also articles with an A, 29A, for example, which is basically just because we have this leaked version where articles have been added in certain places in the draft. So if you have that leaked version, it will make sense. Otherwise, don't bother too much with the articles. They will still change the numbering. All right, so what is risk? Because I will be talking about risk assessment. Eleni already talked about risk, but I will be entering risk assessment and risk management from a little bit of a different angle. So I will also talk a little bit about how the AI Act deals with this kind of risk categories, but I will then try to focus a little bit more on how to assess risk in a methodological sense. So for that, as a starting point, is maybe just a good start to say, okay, what is risk? This is actually a quote from the AI Act, or from the leaked draft. The risk is the combination of probability of an occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. That is by no means new. That's how basically ISO standards for risk management deal with things. That's how data protection impact assessments deal with risk. So basically, it's kind of a function of severity of a certain harm and that likelihood of that harm actually materializing. Another quote from the AI Act there is that harm might be material, immaterial, physical, psychological, societal, or economic. So as with many other impact assessments, the concept of harm is very broad. So it's thinking about very broad risk factors, risk sources, what might happen, what might go wrong, and then trying to assess what is the likelihood and the severity of certain threats. Here on the right, I have kind of a flowchart from the Datenschutz conference from a data protection setting. I am a data protection lawyer, so I will sometimes be referring back to concepts I know very well. And I think this is nice kind of to illustrate that it's a flow, right? A risk assessment is not, you can't really necessarily always put things into scores and boxes. It is kind of a flow that you need to go and assess. Here I have put things in boxes to illustrate another point. Basically, this is a score of risk impact 1 to 4 likelihoods, basically A to D, which is 1 to 4. And this is kind of a mathematical matrix where you multiply, the above the impact times the likelihood, and that gives you neat little boxes of low, medium, high, or very extreme risk. Risks that you have identified. Why did I put that here? Basically, because the explanation there, the key explains very nicely how we think about risk. So you've got low risk, which is basically routine acceptance of risk. I think it's an important concept to realize risk cannot be completely eliminated. And also the AI Act really deals with that in that way that some risk must be accepted. And we routinely accept risk when you walk out on the street. You accept that there's a level of risk in going outside. So that it's important maybe to have the idea that there's different ways to deal with risk. So low risk is routinely accepted. Moderate risk or limited risk is something that should be monitored. And then high risk are things where action should be taken to compensate for that risk. And then extremely high risk adds a level of urgency to having those actions taken. That will come kind of back in some of the things I will be discussing later on. So hence this kind of introduction. Then, okay, harm to what exactly? That's also maybe relevant to consider. What is the things, the goods that we are trying to protect here. This is again kind of a quote from the AI Act: health, safety, and fundamental rights and freedoms of what Eleni already discussed, natural persons affected. So this is kind of the main formulation that keeps on coming back with high-risk systems as well. But the Act does interestingly mention other things: public interests, public health and safety, but also economic interests, social interest, I forgot a comma there, property, critical infrastructure, and the like. So basically, an assessment of risk under AI could cover quite a lot of aspects. It could definitely cover fundamental rights and human rights, social impact, economic impact, but also legislative measures that apply. So other sectoral legislation, data protection law, applicable standards for health and safety, but also ethical values. Yes, I see some very technical comments about risk assessment. Yes, I'm not saying that this is basically how you assess risk, but that's kind of the underlying idea that the legislator, I think, has looked at. Yes, of course, you need to look at things on the time scale. You need to look at how things evolve. That is all part of certain standards I will also be discussing later on. But this is just the basic tenets that the legislator has also mentioned in the Act. And that basically are also part of, for example, data protection impact assessments. All right, some risk sources as well. Just again, this is just basics to keep in mind when we're talking about risk. What are the elements that we're considering? We're considering internal and external risk. We're considering accidental, for example, misuse or deliberate issues. And we're considering then also these, what I call risk source, which is, again, not necessarily the perfect terminology, perhaps, but I think it translates the idea of, okay, we are thinking about everything that is human factor related, so oversight, governance, knowledge, AI literacy, management, organizational measures, all of these things is either human factors or ways to manage that human factor that you must have in place. Then you've got technical challenges of the model. If you have essentially accuracy, robustness, consistency, if you have, again, it interlinks a little bit, but if there's data quality issues or there's issues with your data science, you may introduce risk or you may not mitigate risk. Same for cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And then the other, like residual category, like a natural disaster, is a risk, for example, also to take into account. If the power goes out and your AI system is critical, then it's something you should have considered as well in how to deal with that. All right. This is what Eleni has talked about quite a lot already, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. But so the AI Act does kind of a predetermination already as a first instance of certain types of AI or uses of AI, and says, okay, this has, for us as legislator, has an inherent risk level. I already saw some comments earlier as well that people questioned whether the Commission or the EU legislator is really well placed to make this predetermination already. That is an open question that I'm not going to answer. But the reality of it is that there's already some basic strokes of the brush that say, all right, these are forbidden uses, where we say you cannot do this, even if you put in place as many safeguards as you want. This type of AI system, this type of use is not allowed. Then we have the high-risk systems where we say, okay, this is allowed, but we're going to have quite a lot of basic requirements for systems, which are, again, very high-level, broad kind of risk mitigation measures, in a sense. For example, you have to have a risk management system, you have to have technical documentation, there's requirements for human oversight, for accuracy, robustness, cybersecurity. All of these are just categories of requirements that are meant to address the fact that this is a high-risk situation, so there is potential impact on fundamental rights, on health, on safety, and those requirements are the basic tenets of how to address that risk. But then, for example, the mandatory risk management system actually will require you to look at risk in a much more in-depth fashion. So examples, Aline already covered a number of examples of high-risk AI systems, so I can maybe skip that. Interestingly, though, this list of Annex 3, there are, if you fall under that, but you can show basically that the system has a much more narrow function, whereas basically it meant just to complement human activity or to do a preparatory task or just to reassess an assessment made by a human, then there's kind of an exception to say, okay, then this is potentially not as high risk, because it's just a preparation for a human assessment, or it's just a human assessment that is somewhat refined. So do with that what you will. All right, then we've got those limited risk systems where there's basically transparency, general purpose AI systems where there's the distinction made between systemic risk and non-systemic risk. Wherever there is systemic risk, there are additional obligations. I will not spend too much additional time on that because, in the interest of time, I don't think we can cover it here, but it's essentially there's a specific, for this specific type of AI, there's also a distinction made. And if you have these models that have this huge computational power and potential big influence in society, then there are additional obligations on evaluation of the model, cybersecurity, incident reporting, and also specific risk management obligations. And then we have our residual category of minimal or no risk. So this is basically labeling of categorization of certain AI systems and certain uses as having an inherent risk level. That doesn't mean that, for example, that a limited risk AI system, where there's just transparency requirements, that there cannot be risk there. It's just that it's not been labeled as high risk in and of itself. So risk assessment, I think, will be relevant and not just in high-risk systems. This is just where the EU legislator has said, oh, this is really something where we have to introduce additional requirements. But as always, how you use a system, how you put it in a certain setting, the governance, the management, the knowledge that you have in an organization, all of these elements are going to be relevant, I think, for managing risk in a broader sense. All right, so I've already kind of covered this. So risk can present itself here. I have 3 slides as part of design of the system, deploying the system in a certain context, or using the system and specifically for general purpose AI. So the Act also deals with that in those settings. And so for providers who design the system, there's these quality requirements, the risk management system, which I will discuss in a little bit more detail later, data quality and governance requirements, technical documentation requirements that are really very detailed of explaining to supervisory authorities also, I guess, in the first place, how a system works, transparency requirements, human oversight requirements. So basically the system has to allow for a certain high level of human oversight, has to make it easy for the human to identify instances that might be problematic, to review this, and has to be facilitated. And then this accuracy, robustness, and cybersecurity requirements as well. So that's kind of that's the assessment of providers. So the design of the AI system, things may go wrong. The same as things may go wrong when you're deploying an AI system. So here are the obligations for deployers, specifically of high-risk systems. Again, the systems where the union has said these are the really scary, problematic ones that we will allow, but that where things actually could go wrong. Deployers need to make sure that they use the system correctly in accordance with the instructions, and that they have the technical and organizational measures, competence to do so. They also have to monitor and log the system, which also kind of relates back to the obligation to report. So they report serious incidents. They report also specifically unknown risks to the provider. So the provider may not have thought of certain risks, but in practice it may become clear that other risks exist. Then there has to be a reporting back so that people realize, okay, this is something that we need to account for, that we need to also go test for and see how we can fix things. So there's kind of a feedback loop, if you will, pardon the pun. And then there's also explicit mentions of a data protection impact assessment that may be necessary and quite often will, as soon as you have personal data in the loop. Then under GDPR or law enforcement directive, you will likely have to do a data protection impact assessment. So All of this, I think, also kind of already starts to imply that even maybe if you don't fall under high risk provider obligations, for example, Article 9, where you have to have a complete risk management system in the development of a system, you still need to do some kind of risk assessment as well as a deployer. There's many obligations here that require that you are prepared. I like to make the comparison as well. When I work in a research project, we will do a data protection impact assessment of the solution, and we will then provide that. But any end user will also, under their own obligations, have to do an assessment as well. So I think it's a bit in a similar setting where the provider has to do the basic in-depth assessment, but then there's still kind of an assessment down the line as well, where there are also responsibilities as well. And then, of course, the use of the system may also present risk. I think mostly for general purpose AI, this is addressed with systemic risk obligation. I'm not going to deep dive too much into that because I see I'm already almost halfway in the presentation and there's a couple of slides to go through still. Then this Article 9 risk management system is it's an obligation for providers of high-risk AI systems. And this is a bit reminiscent again of a data protection assessment in the sense that it's a continuous iterative process, has to be completed at the latest, before the testing of the system has to be done before putting it on the market, but it has to be iteratively redone, as well as with this input of the post-market monitoring obligation. What is it looking at? It's looking at known and reasonably foreseeable risks to this health, safety, and fundamental rights. I see a question about the GDPR, independent of the Act, and they complement. I will address this. It's interesting. Yeah, the GDPR and the Act, they exist next to each other. And so it will also become a measure of not duplicating efforts too much. And there's a couple of mentions in the Act as well. So basically, we're looking at known and reasonably foreseeable risks, as well as reasonably foreseeable misuse risks. So you also have to think about how could this be potentially misused, and what are the risks there. And the aim kind of is to have risk elimination measures, because as the last bullet point, you focus on mitigating and eliminating risk as much as possible. When you cannot eliminate risk, you have to have certain mitigation strategies in place. And again, a little bit like a data protection impact assessment, you're trying to get risk to an acceptable level, to a level where you think this is fair and is acceptable. You can never completely eliminate all risk, but for all the risk factors, the risk hazards, the potential issues, you should have them, all of them, separately at that acceptable level, as well as the whole assessment, the whole impact assessment should be at a reasonable, acceptable level of risk. And so these requirements of chapter 2, title 3, chapter 2, as we often refer to, are the main tenets of this. And then you have to test your system for all these identified threats and see if you are at an acceptable risk level. Then a couple of risk management obligations. This is not entirely like, there are little elements here and there throughout the Act of Risk, but I think these are specifically important ones. There's also procedures about risks at the national level, and I will not mention that too much, but some major things is this Article 61 of the current draft that has been leaked, which is this post-marketing or post-putting on the market monitoring of high-risk AI systems to identify other possibly arising risks, which is both on the provider to actively have monitoring and logging obligations, so they need to keep this information, they need to process it, and they need to learn from it. And there's as well the deployers that have a reporting obligation. So that kind of creates a beautiful kind of feedback loop on risks that might not have been fully considered before. There's also this risk management of providers of general purpose AI that I already mentioned. I will not dive too deep into that, but they have specific risk analysis obligations as well. And then an interesting one that I also saw already some comments during the presentation of Eleni is that deployers that are public bodies or private bodies providing public services or essential services have to do a fundamental rights impact assessment for high-risk systems that they deploy, so that they use. There's also requirements in that article for law enforcement. There's also this is quite interesting because it's just a fundamental rights impact assessment. It's not as broad as for example, a provider, There's an explicit link also made with the data protection impact assessment, kind of to avoid duplication and to look, okay, how do these obligations intertwine? And there's an explicit mention of questionnaire templates to be filled out, to be developed by the AI office. Another question I saw is the AI office, where will it be? It will be under the commission, and actually there was a decision on 24th of January establishing this office. So in the future, there will probably some kind of templates for public bodies that need to do this kind of fundamental rights impact assessment before they start using a system. So that comes on top of the deployer obligations that I just discussed of monitoring and logging and reporting and making sure you have the capacity to use the system correctly. On top of that, for certain deployers, there is this requirement because of their public status and the importance as well of certain users to have this kind of fundamental rights impact assessment. So I already kind of covered this, who must assess risk. My opinion is that it's not just limited to providers of high risk AI, and generally the instances where the AI Act says you must do so. And in those cases, it's quite straightforward that you must. But I think quite generally that it's a good idea for deployers of high risk systems to do this. Not only a good idea, I would interpret the obligations that are there as requiring this, practically speaking. I would even go as far as saying it's probably a good idea in other circumstances as well, as part of good practice, as part of compliance with national sectoral rules, or as part of EU legislation. If you have to do a data protection impact assessment, you may as well cover also maybe some other elements. Sometimes funding requirements require this. I work a lot in research projects where we have to do human rights impact assessment or fundamental rights impact assessments in addition to a data protection impact assessment. There may be other reasons. You may be simply mandated by contract. Contractual partners may say, okay, we let you sign an acceptable use policy, and that includes also some requirements for you to go and assess the risk of what you're using, even if it's, for example, not a high-risk system. So who must assess risk? I think a lot of people must assess risk. So that kind of is the reason why I wanted to look at a couple of sources in the question of how do you manage this in practice. I'm going to have to disappoint that I don't have all the answers ready. I think there's a lot of things that are there already that we might want to use, that we might want to look at, in the absence of guidance or templates by the official authority to say, okay, this is what you have to use. And even when those exist, there's quite a lot available already that might inform how to go about this. So again, comparison with the data protection impact assessment, there is no concrete methodology or standard or template provided in the Act to say, okay, this is how you do it. It's the requirements, the building blocks, what must be there is specified, and that's about it. I've seen this term of AI impact assessment flying around. I like it. It's nice to have this kind of term be available, but it doesn't quite cover anything, right? I mean, it's not defined. It's not a concept as such yet. Not like a data protection impact assessment where the law says this is what a data protection impact assessment is. Rather, the AI Act has different assessments: the fundamental rights impact assessments, the risk management system that contains assessment of fundamental rights, but also from health and safety risks. So it's broader. We've got this assessment for general purpose AI. There's different types of assessments that must be addressed in different ways. But in the last, by my count, it's 7 minutes still, but I'll try to finish up in 5. I will look at some sources of what you may look at to inspire the assessment you need. So I will cover kind of all of these assessments and what may be a good inspiration or a good starting point. If you do need to have a data protection impact assessment as well, I think it's a relevant exercise that we do as well in projects to not duplicate very similar assessments for different purposes. In the future, we hope that the AI board will give some guidance, opinions and recommendations. They may also request the AI office to provide templates, standardized templates for basically almost everything that the AI Act covers. We could expect that this kind of fundamental rights impact assessment will be one of the priorities, because this is explicitly mentioned in Article 29A, that the AI office will provide a questionnaire. So it seems that there's a very concrete thought for that to be presented first, which may be a building block as well, because also under Article 9, for example, your risk management system, the assessments that you have to do there also need to cover fundamental rights. So whether that questionnaire will be sufficient seems to have a slightly different purpose, but we will see. All right, this is my overview. I will, in the interest of time, just dive into the more detailed slides. So for human rights impact assessments and fundamental rights impact assessments, because to me that is very similar, there are a couple of good sources already. So you've got this UN guiding principles, and then there's a number of methodologies. I've named one here and a handbook that we use in projects as well for doing a human rights impact assessment. So this is already, there's existing methodology for this. So that is a good basis, I think, even in the absence of the templates that we already mentioned, to go about this, because usually you don't want to wait for legislation to apply to start preparing. So I think it's a good start if you are developing systems to already make yourself a little bit acquainted with the methodologies that are out there. There's also this HUDERIA, so Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law Impact Assessments, developed under the auspices of the Council of Europe, and that is specific to AI. The other ones in this case are not specific to AI, which is why I generally term this as a general kind of source. I see one of the comments here in the corner of my eye. It's indeed AI Draft Act. We're not really at the AI Act just yet. It's important to indeed keep that in mind. This is kind of a methodology. It's not a template as much. It's also not a methodology that's available, ready to be implemented. But this is an open access book that I think is a really good introduction to the topic of having all these assessments combined. How do you not overly duplicate? How do you integrate the human rights, the ethical angles, the social angles, data protection angles in an AI impact assessment? For high-risk systems, you might want to argue that this is the category where you will have to cover all of these elements, and where real AI impact assessments kind of templates or structure may start to emerge. So this is a very interesting read. It's open access, so it's free, so it doesn't cost anything to have a look. I think it's a really good source, but do not expect that this will solve all your problems right away either. Then ethical guidance. I will talk about ethical guidance and ethical methodologies. Of course, the high-level expert group guidance on ethics is relevant. The Altai list is a relevant tool. There's a significant overlap, of course, with the AI Act. So these are ethical principles, but they also are going to be partially legal principles. So I think this remains a relevant source to start from. It's not all comprehensive, but remains a good place to kind of attack it if you're new to this. Then I also have ethical compliance methodologies. These are specifically for AI as well. And these are, this is my last bullet there, these are not light ethics. You know, these are not like ethical documents to have a nice think about how ethics may impact AI. These are relatively comprehensive or very comprehensive methodologies to go about ethical risk assessment. But ethics, again, has significant overlaps with what the AI Act will regulate. So it is also quite regulatory in a way. For example, CAP-AI is one that I think is quite interesting. This includes the high-level expert group AI guidance, is aligned with OECD recommendations. It's aligned with previous versions of the AI Act draft. So that is definitely a very interesting one. And then I have one on the next slide that I will highlight. It's also interesting to highlight that there are specific methodologies for certain sectors. I saw a question about, is law enforcement covered? Yes, it is. And there is, under the auspices of Europol and Centric, we have a methodology for accountability principles of AI, which is the ethical element. And they are working on an AI Act compliance tool as well, which is usually only available for law enforcement. So if you are working with law enforcement, it's possible to get access to this type of methodology specifically designed for this sector. I need to speed up a little bit. So this ECOLA is kind of a card structure, so you can make it into a conversation or a game almost. It's based on similar sources, and it's based on a scientific research paper. I really like to use this if you are dealing with people, very technical people. If you have a big gap in understanding between technical, legal, ethical, this is a nice way to bridge that gap. DPIA guidance from the CNIL and the ICO. Yeah, sorry, the ICO, maybe the UK is no longer part of the EU, but I think they still have good guidance. that is still relevant to inspire us as well. They deal similarly with controls in different AI lifecycle processes or stages for data protection angle, which might inspire your DPIA process, but also might inspire a more integrated process. Then basically I have a couple of ANISA reports here about risk assessment methods and standards in general. They list them, they compare them, they look at interoperability. Very interesting to see how existing risk standards, general ones like ISO 31000 family or information security management standards like ISO 27000 family, how that might feature into a risk assessment approach. And then there's also specific guidance on AI risk management from both ENISA and the National Institute in the US for Science and Technology, Standardization and Technology, sorry. So the list, this is also quite interesting to have a look at. Almost there. There are also a couple of recent ISO standards on AI risk management specifically. So if you want to look at something standardized, this is really interesting. We have one about risk assessment at the organization level, which is more broader. How does the organization deal with AI and benefits and risks? Is a little bit more generalized. And then we have another one on basically based on ISO 31000 general risk management and risk management procedures for AI systems in an organization. So these are definitely interesting sources as well to have a look at. And then my last or second to last slides, there are things on the market as well. OneTrust has a nice AI governance solution that is available. IPP has training and certification for AI governance that covers a lot of these things that I've just mentioned. So my idea was just to give you some entry points into how you might deep dive into risk assessment from here on out. So last thing, and then I will release the floor. Sorry, Hans, for just going over time. There's a lot of guidance, like this, but they have similar ideas. They have ideas of monitoring risk throughout the AI lifecycle, typically with a continuous and iterative process. Currently, I think there's quite a lot to review, but I do assume that tailored methodologies for certain project sector settings will emerge, and the market will continue to provide more input. But we are waiting to an extent also for guidance by the AI board and AI office. Even though we have to be realistic, that's going to be a while. So I think it still does make sense to familiarize yourself with the basics, with what is already there, to prepare for the AI Act. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the solid overview. I feel like there's a lot of guidance to consider. I feel like that's the understatement of the morning. Thank you for doing such a great job in mapping what is already out there, because I think one of the large questions that also comes back from the chat is, how do we actually do this, and are we trying to reinvent the wheel, or some critical comments like, isn't this going to stop us from using international standards? But looks like there's a lot of tools already out there. Honestly, I knew less than half of them. I think just having this solid overview of what already exists gives us an idea of how risk assessment might be approached in the context of AI deployment. Just to repeat, the session is recorded, so everybody will get the recording and the slides. But I think we had a ton of questions from the chat. We won't be able to go over all of them, but I'll try to pick up on a couple of the relevant ones. Just check, Eleni, are you still in the room? Hopefully, yes. Okay, there we go. There you are.
Yes, of course.
Excellent. Just checking. So I have
your signal to turn my camera on.
Oh, that's that signal hereby given. So yeah, I think honestly, I have like 3 pages of questions alone, but let's try to dig in some things. I wanted to maybe start with you, Eleni, because we had some questions about to discuss sort of the scoping of what will be covered by the AI Act as far as we understand it. I like the flowcharts that you have on the slide with the different factors. Look at whether you are the forbidden category, the high risk, but also explaining sort of the role of the annexes with the conformity assessment products, generative AI. It does kind of look and feel to a large extent like the legislator kind of changed their mind a couple of times along the way on what they wanted to cover. Because one approach would have been to say, define risk criteria. That would be one approach. Another would have been, no, we look at conformity assessment and we amend that process a little bit. And instead they did both of those. And then it feels like generative AI became a hot topic, and then that was sort of thrown in as well, because you couldn't have legislation that didn't say anything about generative
That's
AI.
exactly what happened. And there was a lot of political debate between Germany and France and the rest, so this is not for this forum. So what we see here as the result is really an amalgam of proposals, negotiations, amendments, giving in something and taking something back in return. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the final text with the recitals, because the recitals often are the ones that explain us how did we get to a specific provision, what is meant by that, etc., etc. I agree that we couldn't leave generative AI out. We couldn't leave general AI models out. At least the fact that we have these transparency obligations very clearly outlined, I think it is a good thing. My problem is enforcement, and that's something that we didn't touch, and that's something that we cannot touch today. We also need to see what will happen in the end. But enforcement is a huge thing. So there are big fines foreseen for non-compliance with requirements of the AI Act. There is an issue. We see it already with the GDPR, especially when you have somebody
nationally, the enforcement is like market authority. So there it follows like the market's introduction, the conformity assessment approach for national level enforcement, I think.
Yes, but what I was going to say is that the biggest problem is when you have a developer that is established outside the European Union. It's the same problem we see with the GDPR. How do you enforce that? We don't have the tools at the moment. So maybe this is something we can really work on. It's not only having legislation that foresees very strict provisions, very strict fines. We also need to find a way to effectively, efficiently, and quickly enforce these. And within the European Union, we have more or less the tools to do it. But what about the rest?
And even then, and this is maybe a nice step to Peter's session. So we have the tools to do it and enforcing it. When you started the session, Peter, I thought, the whole impact assessment thing and risk assessment, like we know how this is done in the GDPR, but here again, we have the same kind of issue. So this is partially GDPR and partially human rights and fundamental rights impact assessment. That's part of it, but it's broader than that even. So you have to do sort of the risk assessment tools that are available. They're extremely broad. And you mentioned a huge amount of valuable sources, some international ISO standards, which is great. At least one of them was frankly entirely new to me, but also a lot of books that you can do about that. But it is a lot though, isn't it? It's if you have to puzzle, you must have done a lot of research just to keep an overview of all of the books that are out there. And now somebody is going to have to synthesize that in a form that's functional, and it's also part of the feedback from the chat, we're introducing obligations for Europeans again, a lot of paperwork. How is this actually going to make a difference? So do you have any sort of perspective? Like, what is your sort of feeling on that? Do we need someone to, like Etsy or Senelec or does somebody need to synthesize this? Or do you think, market needs some time to sort this out? Because it doesn't seem that easy to work with in practice.
I was going to make a pun about AI being able to synthesize that guidance.
We should ask ChatGPT. Good point. I overlooked that.
But it is honestly, the corpus is of a size that you might almost think about non-human ways to do this, because it is massive. There's some general tenets though. I am also working on this actually to find a methodology that we can use in research projects, even though AI doesn't apply to research, but it does apply, when the product is out there. But there's enormous amounts of overlap. I do hope that some people with more time and energy in the market will try to provide solutions, or the AI office. Apparently, they are going to hire 100 people. There's a lot of discussion and debate about that, because they're going to move money from Digital Europe to this. But I think the Commission has realized there is a lot out there. People have been doing concurrent efforts to make this more clear. It would be good probably that not everybody starts to develop their completely own approach, but that, like with the data protection impact assessment, in the beginning we all kind of did our own thing, but then there was alternative guidance and everybody starts to align a bit in how they do impact assessments. I also wanted to address one specific comment from Peter Singleton, which I think is a really good one. not only do you need your likelihood on a time scale, you also, indeed, he says, and it's very true in what he says, you need impacts to be measurable. And that is something that we, in the what Eleni mentioned in this, what she organized in Tilburg, we have talked about this as well, about how do you make, in that case, we were talking about ethics and ethical assessments. How do you make that measurable? How do you make KPIs out of that? How do you measure risks and then the outcomes and whether you've addressed that risk? I think, yeah, there's quite a lot there already, but for some alternative source to kind of say, this is how we're going to do it in AI, would make it at least clearer what we have to do. Because I think now everybody...
And it has to be made meaningful because, and this is data protection impact assessment sort of all over again and with the ethics ones. So you have the parties that do it seriously and say, okay, I'm going to evaluate this up front. And now this is how I'm going to behave. This is how I'm assessing my risk. And now I'm going to bring my product to the market. You also have, and in my experience, that's the majority of them. One said, already built the product, I already built the service, I've already gone to market. Now let's do the paperwork to legitimize what we're doing. And that's also, this is why people sometimes get a little bit cynical saying, okay, this is creating overhead. But that sort of depends on how seriously you take this work. And I think indeed that might be a good hint for future development works, making sure that you have measurable criteria so that something that can be enforced as well. That would be important too, I think. Yeah.
If I can just add one single thing, because I saw a question that I maybe have created confusion. The question is, do we need to have an EU-funded research project in AI impact assessment? If you only use AI within the research project to provide recommendations, guidelines, policy, these type of things, no, the AI doesn't apply. What I'm talking about is if it's a system that is meant to be put on the market thereafter. So if you're in, for example, an innovation action where you're going towards the market, or even in a research and innovation action, if that is the end goal, then I think you may want to do that. Plus, ethics always relevant. So
ethics always relevant. That's true. But actually, this also raises. There's a point that somebody else raised. I think it was during Eleni's presentation, exactly on the scoping, on what gets covered. Because, and this is kind of a consequence of what I mentioned earlier, that it does this. AI Act is sort of this weird hybrid between general risk assessment and the markets conformity approach. There's a lot of gray area and a lot of comments, questions picked up on that. On the general focus is on providers and making a system available in the market. It talks a lot less about the responsibility of users. Like you say, I'm for instance, a law firm or accountant or a doctor using an AI-based system. There's a lot less focus on them relying on those systems, and that kind of is also pushed to the same way as it's done with medical devices. It's kind of pushed to the providers, so they have to check that their product is fit for purpose. But then what actual service providers do with that in practice, that's largely unregulated. Like just taking our example, if we're a law firm and we want to be a bad law firm, which we don't, but if we want to ask legal questions to an AI and just present that to the clients, we don't have an obligation under the AI Act to disclose that we would be doing that to clients, because we're not bringing an AI product in the market as decision support. So seems like there's a lot of hidden users that will still continue to work in the dark. You can argue that it's not a problem because they remain responsible anyway, but that's actually something that the AI Act doesn't really touch upon, it seems, other than that concept of the deployers in the public sector and essential services. So they have to assess risk.
Hans, we need to look very carefully into the provisions of generative AI, because there is this obligation that when a decision comes from an automated system, from a generative AI system, you need to inform the users. We need to see whether there are loopholes. So we need to be very careful with the wording. That's why we can't, within these few days, give definitive answers. But there are things with a question mark, because for generative AI, they don't require an element of risk, right? Even these are considered having low risk. Still, you have this transparency obligation. So I wouldn't say so bluntly that you don't need to inform, unless you use it as a basis for making your own decisions. And then when you have the human oversight and the intervention of a human being who actually makes the final decision, maybe you don't need to. So these are things that we still need to clarify. One last thing, if I may, very quickly, there was a question that I think is valuable. What about AI systems that are already placed in the market? Because I guess that is relevant for several people that already deploy systems. There are transitional provisions, so you will find them in Article 83 of the AI Act at the moment in this leaked version, that's Article 83. There are specific rules when, so they give a transition period. So when there is an AI system that's a component of large-scale IT system, then there is a transition period until the end of 2030 to bring the relevant requirements in compliance with the regulation. So there are transition periods foreseen, and you need to see whether you fall under them.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I mean, we're getting sort of close to the end of the session now, but a lot of this sort of hinges on subjectiveness, and there's always appreciation. Risk assessment means someone assesses, so someone decides this is risky, this is not risky, this is a vulnerable user, this is not a vulnerable user. So there's a lot of subjectiveness. Do you think, and this is sort of asking you for like a closing statement, a closing observation, do you think that the AI Act there, just not your opinion as lawyers, just as citizens, but just based on what you know from the AI Act right now, do you expect that this will have a significant beneficial impact, that it will be an improvement in the market, that people think a lot more about these types of risks? So how happy are you basically with what you know of the AI Act so far? Maybe Galene, you can go first.
Yeah, I can just say very quickly that definitely we needed something. That's my personal opinion. We needed something, and at least to the extent that we have prohibited actions, prohibited practices, which is very important.
Very valid.
For sure, we needed a legislation that says you cannot do this, because until now, all interactions with companies and technical people was like, if we can technically do it, why not? Ethics is something that is not inherent at the moment in the development of systems. That's why we try to put a lot of focus on this. And definitely having a system of conformity assessment for high-risk applications, I think, is important. How long it will take until it becomes trivial for developers and for producers to think about these requirements, that's something that remains to be seen.
And I think that's, there's a growth period, definitely. Peter, your perspectives. Are you happy with the AI Act, or would you have done it differently? That's a much meaner question.
Those are two questions, Hans.
Those are two different questions.
Would I have done it differently? Probably. I think it's very different. It would be very weird if it was exactly as I would have done it. But I am happy, not only as a lawyer, because this will bring quite a lot of work and opportunities for us. But I really think that indeed what Eleni said as well, you had to, these broad strokes of saying this is not acceptable, this is high risk. So here we're going to force you to look at it and to think about it, to get this conformity assessment so the market doesn't flood with whatever. I think if we want to harness AI in the future, it's important to make sure that it doesn't completely go the wrong way, because otherwise people will lose trust. And I think it needed to be done. It's what the EU is good at, regulating, and we are doing also in the world stage what we are supposed to do, I think.
And that's sort of a weird finding. It's like, I think nobody is it's like it's supposed to go problem. Nobody's 100% happy, but I think you captured the consensus very well that something needed to be done here. Obviously, there's a lot of gray areas. People asking also right now in the chat saying, can we rely on companies to do this reliably and accurately? Maybe not, but at least we're pushing them to the obligation of thinking about this and justifying it. And we have the conformity assessment body, so it's not entirely for some applications you actually have to check with a third party, and it's not entirely in the hands of companies themselves saying, I think I can get away with it. So there is a compromise there, but definitely we need a lot of growth time there. We're actually already a couple of minutes over time. I think we still have a lot of questions to cover, but unfortunately we do have to wrap up here. I see a lot of people unfortunately have to leave already. So I just want to take a minute, obviously, to thank both of our speakers for the presentations, but also for the phenomenal amount of research that you put into your slide deck. I think it's not a coincidence that people are asking for your slide deck and thanking you for the material that you've prepared. There's a lot to study, there's a lot to dig into, but I think you've helped the audience along the way there. And thank you also to the audience. As usual, you've been very helpful in providing critical and constructive and occasionally also funny observations on the questions we need to ask. So thank you very much to you, both the speakers and to the audience. As I mentioned, please feel free to leave us some feedback on how you like the session and what you want us to handle further. We have at least 2 requests asking for more AI sessions in the future to keep you posted on what will happen. We'll all have to be following this in the next couple of years. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. It was the last for now in the series of AI webinars, but I think there will be more in the future, and we look forward to discussing it with you further as this debate continues. Thank you very much, and have a very good day, everyone.